Hi, I'm Jane. I'm from Poppy Patchwork in Bristol, and today I'm going to show you how to put binding onto your quilt. For the purposes of this demonstration, I've made a small quilt which is ready for the binding. The first thing you need to do is work out how much binding you need to cut. In order to do this, we need to measure the quilt. So this quilt measures 21 inches along this side, and it also measures 21 inches along this side. So when you've got that, you take your 21 and you add it to the other side, 21, to make 42, and you multiply that to get the full circumference of your quilt. So in this case, that is 84 inches. So we need 84 inches to go all the way around this quilt. So now we need to get the fabric. So this is the fabric that we're going to use for the binding. This fabric measures a standard 42 inches across the width. Because we need 84, we divide it by the 42 inches of the width of the fabric, which means we need to cut 2 widths of fabric. I will cut a third width of fabric. This will give me enough to get around the corners of the quilt. Okay, so now we need to straighten up the fabric. So to do that, I'll just find the straight edge along here, bring the ruler back a wee bit and cut off all those uneven edges. And when you're cutting, please remember always to cut away from yourself. Now that I've cut the uneven edges off, I'm going to turn the fabric around, and I've decided to cut 2.5 inches for my binding. I find that's quite a nice, easy measurement to work with when you're putting your binding on. So now I need to line the ruler up 2.5 inches against that nice neat edge that we just cut, and cut my first strip. Again, always cutting away from yourself. Just ease that out a little bit. Now I'm going to cut my second strip. Again, lining it up nicely. And then I'm going to cut this third strip just to make sure that I've got enough to get around the corners when I'm sewing it to the quilt. So this is the fabric that we're not going to use today, and these are the 3 strips that we are going to use. We'll take these over to the sewing machine now and sew them together. Okay, so we've got our 3 strips that we're going to join together to make one long piece of binding. So to do this, we're just going to open these out and join them together. We're going to stitch it with a diagonal stitch. You can see I've left the selvage edges on, and that's perfectly fine so long as you don't incorporate them into the binding. So I've just created a little cross there, and I'm going to pop a pin in here and another one on the other side here. And I'm going to sew diagonally across that piece of fabric. I'm going to do the same on the other end of this piece of binding strip. So again, we're going to lay it right sides up and take the other piece of binding and lay that right sides together. Again, making sure that those selvages are just sticking out slightly. Just grab 2 more pins. And again, pin it in the corner here and in the corner here. So now we're going to take that to the sewing machine and sew it. Okay, so we've brought the fabric over to the sewing machine and we find the first join. I've already put the walking foot onto my sewing machine because we're going to need that later. Right, so I'm just going to lower the foot down onto the fabric. Now, I'm just going to eyeball this, but you can draw a line across if you wish to follow that. So we're just going to sew that diagonal line to join these two pieces of fabric. And then we get the second piece, just down here somewhere. Here we go. And we repeat the sewing again. So we've now sewn these two pieces together. We're going to snip them apart just here, and I'll show you that at the cutting board. Okay, we're back at the cutting board, and I'm just going to cut this little bit of thread here that is joining the two pieces. There we go, now they're separated. I'm going to remove the pins, and then I'm going to take the ruler and cut 1/4 of an inch away from that sewn line. So now when we fold it back, we have a beautiful diagonal line. We're going to do the same again on the other piece. So once again, get your fabric nicely on the cutting board. Line your ruler up so that the 1/4 inch line on the ruler is on your sewing line, and take the rotary cutter and cut the excess away. There we go. Now we're going to take it to the ironing board. Okay, so now we're going to press the fabric into the binding strip. So the first thing we need to do is just iron those seams that we've pressed. One there, and bring the other one, and again press that seam. Now we need to press the binding in half lengthways. So we just fold it and press. So we're just going to press this fabric along its length in half. At this point, I don't worry about the little dog ears on the seams. We can deal with that later, if at all. So now we've pressed it in half along its length. Okay, so we've just pressed this in half lengthways. So we've got a folded edge and the raw edges on the same side there. And now we're going to attach this to the quilt. So I'll go over to the sewing machine to do this. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine now, and this is when we're going to be putting the binding onto our quilt. So what we're going to be doing is putting the raw edges of the binding up against the raw edges of the quilt. When we place the binding strip onto the side of the quilt, we need about 8 inches left over, and we need to start it about, this is a small quilt, I'm going to start it about 3/4 of the way along the side of the quilt there. I popped a pin in there to show me where I'm going to start, and we'll take it over to the sewing machine now. So at the sewing machine, I've got my walking foot on the sewing machine, and I need to make sure that the needle is going to drop down 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edges. So I've got my ruler, I'm just going to line up where that is, and on my sewing machine I can just swing the needle over slightly so that it ends up in a nice position. So that's about 1/4 of an inch there, and that's where I will sew along. So we're just sewing along the length here, getting our raw edges up against the quilt. As we come to the corner, we are going to stop about 1/4 of an inch away from the end of the side of the quilt. So I just keep checking it as I come in towards there. So I'm about 1/4 of an inch away now. I'm just going to put the needle down into the fabric, and we're just going to twist the fabric around a little bit so that we can sew off into the corner and then cut our threads. So what we can see here is we've sewn along here 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. We've stopped 1/4 of an inch away from the end of the side, and we've left the needle in the fabric and sewn off at an angle into the corner. So to turn the corner now, we're going to bring the fabric back, creating an angle here. And that's where the little stitching came very useful. And then we're going to bring this fabric down, folding it at the edge of the quilt. We're going to take that to the sewing machine now. You can pop a pin in it just to keep it nice and secure. Again, pop it in and start sewing. Now we've just gone around our 4th corner, so we're coming to the end. We're coming to the point where we need to join the 2 end pieces together. And we want to leave a fair distance between them so that we're not struggling too much when we do this. So I'm going to sew about 1/4 of the length down and then stop sewing. Just going to put a little quick reverse stitch in there to secure the end. And now we're going to join these 2 ends together. Okay, so now we've got our 2 end pieces and we want to join these together in a nice professional neat way. So in order to do this, we're just going to lay them out on the quilt, one on top of the other. Now this bottom one you can see is very close to where the stitching has finished. So I'm just going to cut some of that excess length off. You can see here I have a nice little mat at the side of my sewing machine. I find this really useful. I'm just going to cut that bit of fabric off. Now I'm going to find where to cut this longer piece of fabric. There's a nice little formula that you can use for this. The fabric that we cut was 2.5 inches wide, so I just need to cut this fabric, this piece of tail, 2.5 inches longer than the piece underneath. So I'm just going to line up my ruler here, find out where 2.5 inches is and mark that with a pin. So just line it up with the end of the fabric underneath, find out where that 2.5 inches is, pop a little pin mark in it there, try not to catch the piece underneath, do that again. There's the 2.5 inches there, just going to mark that. Let's just see if I got that right. So I've got 2.5 inches marked on the top piece. I'm just going to move that back a wee bit. There, I'm happy with that. I'm now going to put that on my cutting mat and I'm going to cut the fabric there. Just taking the pin out and cutting 2.5 inches. So we've now cut our fabrics to the right length and now we need to join them together. And to do this, we're going to have to do the same thing as we did before, right sides together and joining at a diagonal. So I've pulled the fabric here, we're right sides together. I'm just going to double check that that is going to be sewn in the right way. So I'm going to take a pin and just place it very roughly across that diagonal line and open it out to see if when it's open the fabric lies in the correct place, and it does. So we're going to go back here. We've got the fabric right sides together in that little cross shape. I'm just going to move that pin now up to that corner, grab another pin for the other corner, and then I'm going to sew in a diagonal line from here across here. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine. Okay, back at the sewing machine now, so we're going to just bring the fabric up, placing it under the sewing machine, and when we're totally happy, we'll start sewing. Just going to remove the pins now and check that it is going to fit, and that looks pretty good. So just move the sewing machine out of the way and then we'll do a little bit of cutting. So now all we're going to do is cut these pieces off that we don't need. So like we did before, we're going to line the ruler up 1/4 inch away from the seam. This can be a little bit tricky and I don't want you to get too concerned about that. We just roughly need to get the bulk cut away. There we go. And now we are ready to do the final stitch to complete our binding. And starting where you left off with your stitching, stitch across the final bit. So just to finish it off, I'll do a reverse stitch or a locking stitch. So now we have the binding attached to the quilt. Just move this sewing machine out of the way. The final thing that you will need to do now is to slip stitch your binding onto the reverse of the quilt. And there you will have beautiful binding for your quilt. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video tutorial useful. It's been brought to you by Jayne from Patchwork. You can find me online or you can find me in the High Street on Westbury on Trueman in Bristol. Bye for now and happy quilting.